Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our weekly philosophical talks with S.Friedman. S.Friedman is the New York Times acclaimed great philosopher, artist, and a scientist, and also a great speaker of ours. First of all, we'd like to thank the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and definitely our amazing speaker, S.Friedman. Also, thank you very much, the audience, for joining us weekly. Please feel free to give your comments, to ask your questions, and to stay active. The topic of today's philosophical talks is youth and wonder. We know no less. Thank you very much. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Aaliyah, for the introduction. I appreciate it as always. I also want to thank the American Consulate General in Almaty, Dana, Elmira, and everyone involved in making these talks possible and in providing the platform for giving a philosophical perspective on a wide range of issues, of common interest, of broad interest, we hope. A lot of these topics are connected to international days, international celebrations. That is true for today's talk. It turns out that August 12th, which is today for me, to yesterday for people in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, in most of the world at this point, is International Youth Day. And so this talk is inspired by that occasion. Now, when I saw that this was in fact, that day, what immediately came to mind was an aphorism that turns out to have been the first aphorism of a book I wrote, many years ago now, about almost 30 years ago. The book is called Issues of Objects, and it's a work of aphorisms. That particular work is a shorter volume. It contains about 150. The very first aphorism, though, is youth and wonder. We know no less. And aside from the emphasis on youth and wonder, there's the emphasis in the aphorism on knowing. That's the philosophical connection, the philosophical dimension to both this talk and to our sense of youth and wonder philosophically and rigorously. When we talk about knowledge within a philosophical context, we're not talking about scientific knowledge. We're not talking about the knowledge of what may happen tomorrow. We're talking about knowledge that's incontrovertible, knowledge that's incontestable, knowledge that is ultimately independent of the past, that can't guarantee the future, and independent of any particular claims or speculations about the future, which has not yet happened. So it's knowledge that I call epistemic. Epistemic is a term, going back to the Greek, that relates to knowing, knowledge. Epistemology is the study of how we know. Epistemic relates to what we can in fact know incontrovertibly, philosophically. The other type of knowledge, scientific, linguistic, societal knowledge that's based on belief or theory or assumption or theoretical claims, is heuristic. The heuristic allows us to survive, to manipulate experience, to anticipate experience, assuming that experience continues more or less as it has in the past. Now, that's an assumption that we make heuristically. Our lives are adapted to this type of world that more or less displays constancy of general patterns. But the philosophic is interested in what's rigorously so, exactingly so. The best way, and I know I've addressed these issues in many of the talks, but I'd like to repeat them because it provides the framework in which we understand all of these issues And it also goes back to a mathematical formulation. If you remember, I'll show it as I often do. In heuristic space, that's what the H stands for. A equals A. That's the basic condition of logic. That refers to the fact that two things, there is such a thing as identity. Any two things can be approximately equal for certain purposes. Two chairs are approximately the same in terms of the function they serve. Something about the appearance will also be in common. But they won't be exactly the same, rigorously the same. They're two different objects. They're occupying two different positions in space. That's enough to make them rigorously distinct. And that distinction is what epistemic space, A is not equal to A, recognizes and embraces. The lack of identity between any two things that we recognize as two and not one. Even if we're talking about 2 points that have no properties against a ground that's empty space, let's say, those 2 points will be in different positions, one to the left of the other. And that distinction means that whatever applies to one need not apply to the other, does not rigorously apply to the other. Well, in that initial aphorism, where I talk about youth and wonder, I'm describing aspects of epistemic space. And what that's saying is the world seen rigorously, epistemically, is a world characterized fundamentally by an enduring youth and an enduring sense of wonder, an experience of wonder. Now, there are a lot of ways to approach the nature of the epistemic, to kind of come to terms with it. One way that is especially appropriate, germane to what we're discussing tonight today, is it's the world that you would see upon first opening your eyes. Now, not first opening your eyes when you wake up in the morning, and not first opening your eyes to the world as a baby, where you haven't developed, powers of cognition, of a mature, human being, an adult, even a teenager. But imagine what the world would look like if, with our adult developed powers of perception and cognition, we were to find ourselves in this world for the very first time and opened our eyes to it. We would not have had any prior experience. We wouldn't have a sense of the patterns that the past exhibits. We wouldn't have a sense of how the sensations that we're experiencing cohere, converge into objects that will, based on past experience, be expected to sustain themselves, expected to endure, be expected to have a certain constancy of form. That world, the world first viewed, the world that doesn't have anything familiar about it because it hasn't been experienced before, and there's nothing from the past that we're carrying into the present. That's the epistemic. And one way to actually experience it, I tell people, close your eyes. Because insofar as you are seeing objects, insofar as you are seeing chairs and tables, insofar as you are seeing familiar forms, you are seeing heuristic space. You are seeing a space of approximate similarities of one object to another, one object to itself, moment to moment, as time proceeds and as we experience it over time. The epistemic is more rigorous than that. The epistemic is a divergent space. So it's a space that, again, if we imagine seeing the world, this space around us for the very first time, well, it would be astonishing. It would be a wonder space, because we wouldn't have any expectation to it, and all of the forms would effectively present as well, as three things I like to characterize epistemic space as strange, the first time we're encountering it, as beautiful. There's an aesthetic to this experience that, well, we are adapted to, but just the world of colors, the world of abstract art has shown us how beautiful a world of abstraction can be before those abstractions take the form of objects. The art that I do is abstract in that way, and it has that type of primal beauty. I've showed you instances of it. Let me just, again, these images, I know it's hard to see here. It's hard to see unless you actually see it in person, because they're paintings. Those are painted, those are brushstrokes on the back, but you're seeing the work, those images, through the poles, and as you move around them, they change. So you can't see an entire image all at once. So basically, these are painted sculptures, where in order to appreciate the work, you have to move around it. So again, it's not possible to see it in a still, like, video image or camera image. It has to be experienced. But what you're experiencing are images that basically represent the nature of epistemic space, the world that you see before everything congeals or converges into recognizable objects based upon repetition, re-encountering the world. Well, as I'm going to develop a little bit later, it's also a timeless space. It is a space where it's an eternally young space in which age itself is a heuristic concept, a comparative concept. Whenever we're talking about making comparisons, we're talking about convergences, bringing things together, making comparisons. One stage of someone's life to a later stage, that is a fundamentally heuristic process. So that's not present within the parameters, the nature of the epistemic. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit in this regard about a philosopher at Harvard that I actually had a course with. He was the philosopher who taught the Wittgenstein course that I took when I was a sophomore. It was the last main philosophical course that I needed to take to sort of complete the philosophical development that was important to me within an academic context. Prior to arriving at Harvard, I had read through much of the Western philosophical tradition, but I had just touched on Wittgenstein. I didn't want to explore him in depth. I was saving that for college. And it turns out this particular professor, Stanley Cavell, was an extraordinary communicator, an extraordinary philosopher. I, in fact, have a website that I've mentioned in the past. It's called The Books of Joshua, thebooksofjoshua.com. The website is formatted like a book. So when you open it, you're presented with a page, and if you click on active links, oftentimes images, it'll take you from one page to the next in sequence. So one way to approach the website is as a book that you would read, page by page. Well, one of the earliest pages in the book contains some quotations that were especially important to me, growing up and in my sort of intellectual and philosophical development. And one of those quotations is by Goethe. what we inherit, we must earn in order to possess. But another quotation is by Stanley Cavell. And it was a quotation that came out of an essay he wrote called The Availability of Wittgenstein's Later Philosophy. That's one of the most important philosophical essays I've read. It was one of my major introductions to Wittgenstein, though in the course of that class I took from Cavell, I ended up reading Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations 6 times. I've emphasized repeatedly that when you encounter something for the first time, your understanding will never go very deep, right? So you want to re-encounter things no matter what it is. It's one of the reasons why I like to repeat basic concepts like heuristic and epistemic, because the first time anybody hears such ideas, they're going to have not a very deep or broad understanding. That's the nature of human understanding. Well, this quotation by Cavell, which has actually guided my philosophical work, is he felt that Wittgenstein had written in such a way, also he felt it was in common with how Freud wrote, in such a way as to prevent understanding unaccompanied by interchange. That we don't want superficial understanding, we want deep understanding. Now that's an image actually you see of Wittgenstein. We want deep understanding, we want understanding that is transformative. We want philosophically what can address all of the great issues, urgencies, traumas, despairs, challenges of human life. And for that to be achieved through philosophy, it's not sufficient just to kind of read something and get a sense of it. It has to be internalized. We have to see the world through those philosophic eyes. And that's a process. It takes effort. Like anything that has potential value, especially potential value at that level. Okay, well, one of the things that Cavell did not talk about actually when I took the Wittgenstein course from him, but apparently turned to later in his life. And I didn't know about this actually until one of my college roommates, who had also taken 1 or 2 courses from Cavell, sent me his obituary that Cavell had died a few years ago. And the obituary was an appreciation. It was written, or the one that I read was written by a former student. And it talked about how later in his career and in his life, in going around to different universities, Cavell would talk a lot about the concept of earliness. The concept of earliness being how we encounter the world when our eyes are new to it. Just what I was stressing, that is the nature of experiencing the epistemic. We experience the epistemic when we try to imagine, try to experience the world as if we were doing so for the first time, and as if we were doing so every moment for the first time. Now, that's obviously challenging. It's not something that we're necessarily going to live in terms of. We don't need to live in terms of it. We just have to have glimpsed it, at some point. When I took my first philosophy course, it was a seminar. That's the first philosophy course at Harvard. It was a seminar. And the reason that introductory philosophy courses at Harvard are given as seminars is an effort has to be made to experience certain philosophic visions, certain ways of looking at the world. And that's not best communicated through lecture, that's best experienced and discussed as part of a group where one is trying collectively to achieve that philosophical vision and direct understanding. Well, one of the things that they tried to teach us was how to see the world in terms of, well, the technical term is sense data, but it's how to see the world in terms of our direct experience of the sensations of the world without seeing everything in terms of the objects that, again, past experience allows to form in our minds. So the experience of earliness, the experience of sense data, are the experiences that are central to the experience of this epistemic space that is philosophic space, that is rigorous space, that is space independent of presumptions based on the past and projections into the future. And it is the space that corresponds to various religious visions and ambitions. It is the space that corresponds to Zen Satori, to Buddhist enlightenment, to Christian or theistic mystical union with God. So it gives the logic of those religious aspirations that are otherwise directed by faith or by belief. In the case of philosophy, our path is directed by rigor. And rigor is a difference. And the difference that we're embracing is the difference that distinguishes each moment from the next, so that each moment is fundamentally strange and beautiful and new. And that is the youthful vision of the world. And that is the vision of the world experienced in its wonder. It's when we become dulled to experience, when we become dulled by familiarity, that, there's the sense in the biblical book from the Old Testament, Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun. All is vanity, vanity of vanities. It's a despairing vision, nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new, in many instances, heuristically under the sun. Epistemically, everything is always new. Everything is always fresh. Everything is always a youthful vision, the vision of whatever we're experiencing, seen for the first time. Well, now, Youth and Wonder, we know no less, is the first aphorism of that book, Issues of Objects. A later aphorism addresses this theme of youth and the youthful vision in relation to philosophy, but it deals with a very youthful vision. It deals with a game, peekaboo. Now, peekaboo is a child's game. It's apparently played in different ways. The way it was played when I was a baby was, I think my mother would cover my eyes, and then, she would cover my eyes. I would think the world had disappeared. Then she'd remove them, and there she would be. Okay. Some instances it might be, where the mother or the father covers their eyes or their face, and the child, before he develops a sense or she develops a sense of what's called object permanence, thinks the mother has disappeared, the father has disappeared, and then they reappear magically. Well, the cognitive psychologist Piaget was one of the first to investigate the development of cognition in children and the recognition of object permanence, that objects don't disappear when we close our eyes, is seen as one of the most important stages of human cognitive development. But it's actually a stage of human heuristic cognitive development. That is heuristic space taking form. As heuristic space, as we sort of learn to expect that objects will not disappear when we're not experiencing them, that the world doesn't disappear when we turn our back on it, that a tree falling in the forest will make a sound if it makes a sound when we're present. Well, those conceptions are purely heuristic ideas. Now, they help us maneuver through the world. They help us navigate experience. They help us survive in this world insofar, in so long as it persists, more or less, as it has in the past. That's not the experience of epistemic space, that heuristic accommodation, that growing into the heuristic is growing into approximations and assumptions and presumptions based upon past experience. It helps us survive. It does not save us. It does not bring us to mystical union with God. It does not bring us to Buddhist enlightenment. It does not bring us to the epistemic. It's in the opposite direction. Now, one thing I emphasize is we are adapted, our brains sort of accommodate to heuristic processes. That's what language is grounded in. That's what concepts are based upon. These clustering of experiences based upon, well, what Wittgenstein called family resemblances, approximate similarities for some purpose or other. But it's not what leads us to a complete solution to the problem of human life here and now and independently of all future experience. Now, I've emphasized a lot that because we're adapted to that type of vision, that heuristic space, because we grow into it, it's not easy to leave it behind, and it would be impractical to leave it behind. I stress that the epistemic, true philosophic reality is something that one should have a sense of. One should enter it or experience it at least once to see what it is. And one should always have the capacity, as actually my philosophical work has allowed me to develop, of stepping into it when the need arises. When does the need arise? At the moment of death. The need arose when I was experiencing the earthquake, and it looked as if I was in fact at the moment of death, or when experiencing extreme physical pain, or in states of despair, or in whatever intolerable set of circumstances one wants to remove oneself from. One can step into the epistemic. I describe philosophy as a switch, not a prison, not a fixed point of view or belief, but freedom. The ability to enter the epistemic, which is always at our disposal because it's the ultimate reality, is what makes human suffering, human pain, voluntary. It becomes overwhelming, intolerable, one can always turn on the switch of philosophy. That's what the aphorisms are for. That's how I've used them, as a switch, not a prison. So, there's the aphorism in that book, Issues of Objects, peekaboo. We learn at last the child's role, right? We learn at last that epistemically, what the child is experiencing at that early stage of development is what we have to re-experience to come to terms with ultimate epistemic reality. The truth of a rigorous divergent space. not an approximate convergent heuristic space. So there's a depth of wisdom, philosophic wisdom, in what that child is experiencing. The world behind your back, so far as you can ever know when you're not experiencing it, may in fact disappear. You cannot make a claim about what a tree falling in a forest does when no one observes it. What you say decides for you, for the society, what a fact is, what you assume a fact to be, the constancy of objects when no one's experiencing them. That's a heuristic construction. That's not the nature of epistemic reality. That ultimately is the philosophic rigor that, in religious terms, is redemptive, right? Because it's the ultimate reality. We suffer that we presume more than we know in every situation, except when we're dealing with confronting the epistemic to the end of time. It's the basis of despair and of suffering. There's a follow-up aphorism. So, peekaboo, a child's game secures our ends. That youthful vision, that naive, childlike vision is philosophically profound. And a subsequent aphorism comes a little bit after that one, is a child's game secures our ends. And what are our ends? What are the ends that we seek? A complete solution here and now. We seek what religions have aspired to. And that's what rigor provides. That's what epistemic space allows us to experience. Okay? So you see how it's close to childhood before children become acculturated to the heuristic. Now, in Phalaris's Bull, and I've made a lot of reference to that play that I did in New York a few years back. It's autobiographical. It contains excerpts from a narrative poem, the Books of Joshua, that I've also quoted from in the past. And it's philosophic, right? Basically, the first half of the play is focused on my sort of emotional development, on the encounter with the experiences, the issues that made philosophy urgent for me. And then the second part are some of the philosophical results that development ultimately led to. Early on, there are a couple of paragraphs about the relation between philosophy and youth, childhood, the vision of youth. And it goes like this. To undertake philosophy is to see the world through a child's eyes. Wonder, novelty, strangeness, fear, where the most important thing is to feel safe and at home. To move as in a dance of love and joy in endless play. But children want answers. That's why they ask so many questions. But the answers don't lie in a child's eyes. Children see conceptually and draw as they see, stick figures. But nature is only approximately geometry. Faces are never circles. The truth of the world is as Rembrandt drew, in singular precision. Children see to the concept of God. Rembrandt saw oppositely to the truth of Eden. Now, I didn't draw this, but let me quickly draw you. I think you know what I mean when I talk about stick figures. So when children draw, they'll draw things like this, right? This is not how a human being looks. It's basically our concept of a human being. Now, people often say, well, that's because the child hasn't developed the dexterity. Drawing isn't in the hands, it's in the eyes. It's a matter of how we see things. A child that's drawing like that, or the way the child draws houses or landscapes or the sun, is drawing it schematically. They're drawing a sketch of the world, an abstraction, really, of the world. They're drawing their concept of a person. Because by the time they have enough dexterity to draw at all, they're already acculturated. Their cognitive development has allowed the assimilation and the development of these heuristic categories, for experience. So by the time they are drawing, they're already seeing heuristically. They have grown out of their early vision, their early, if you like, epistemic vision. They're not seeing the world epistemically. They're not seeing the world as it presents to the retina in terms of sensation, in the way Rembrandt is seeing the world in specific detail that captures the visual impression that world makes. Right? I think we should have a drawing by Rembrandt, is one to show you, but in the meantime, let me just, if you might be able to see this, if it doesn't come up. Oops, I don't think we can see that well. Can you see that? Yes, you can get a sense of that. You see, the perception that goes into that, it's a matter of seeing the landscape. The rendering is secondary to the perception, the detailed rendering of what is confronting the eyes in terms not of the concept of the landscape, but the present and pressing reality of it. Children, again, by the time they are drawing stick figures, are drawing concepts. They are at a remove from epistemic space. The enterprise of philosophy, effectively, is to bring them back, to bring us back, which can take many years, decades, right? It's taken me a long time to develop my philosophical work. It can take a long time for somebody coming to my philosophical results really to assimilate them. Philosophy is difficult. It's presenting a vision of the world that's not the commonplace, not the heuristic representation of experience. So, in relation to the child conceptual rendering of the world, drawing stick figures, we have a comment by Picasso. It takes a very long time to become young, where to become young is to reacquire that primal vision, that vision of earliness, that vision of the world first viewed. Now, Picasso actually had a little something else in mind by that. I am adopting that aphorism because it represents the return to the epistemic, which is a long, many decade-long, often process, right? In the same way as the process of achieving satori, or of achieving Zen enlightenment, or understanding a Zen koan, is often a process of many years, decades, study and focus and concentration, effort. Remember the closing line from Spinoza's The Ethics: everything excellent is as difficult as it is rare. Difficult, right? Not Not willfully difficult. It's difficult because we are acculturated. We are cognitively sort of oriented to seeing and experiencing and operating within heuristic space. Epistemic space is strange, but beautiful and new. Okay. Now, in terms of some other aspects of youth that intersect philosophy, we have to characterize youth generally, actually, in almost empirical terms, and in contrast it with age. Well, youth, young people, see forward. Old people, age, sees back, sees backward, right? Young people, in general, youth is looking to the future, looking to possibilities to come. They don't have a lot of experience, right? They don't have decades, of life on Earth that is, can be the focus of their meditations, their reminiscing, right? There's not a lot to reminisce about, right, when you're young. Typically, the first few years of one's life, one will have no recollection of. I have very few, but very specific early memories. I happen to have a recollection of my first birthday, but I don't think that's that common. I have recollections from when I was like 2, 3, 4, partly because of traumatic incidents that happened, not ultimately horrific, but problematic enough, like playing when I was 2.5, maybe, with a neighbor. We were toddlers, and there was a scissors. We were cutting some paper or something, and somehow it got in my friend's eye. So I remember that because of how traumatic that was. But in any case, so I have some early memories, but that's not that common, right? We don't have that many early memories. So, when we're 6, 7, 8, 9, we're looking forward. When we're 10, 11, 12, 13, we're still looking forward. When we're in our 20s, we're mostly looking forward. But when we're in our 70s and 80s and 90s, we're mostly looking back. So one of the ways that one wants to maintain youth, a youthful outlook, is look forward. Don't focus on the past. Now, philosophically, we are in a position to liberate ourselves from the past, right? The past cannot guarantee the future. It's the future that has the power to decide the reality, to decide the past. The future can take any possible form, and the form that it takes has the power to establish the reality that we embrace. So philosophically, we are oriented fundamentally to the future, not to the past, because again, the past cannot guarantee a course of future events. Scientifically, we embrace the past. We embrace the generalizations from the past. If we want to know what the weather is likely to be tomorrow, well, we look at yesterday's weather. We look at yesterday's weather, depending upon where we are on the earth. In California, we look at yesterday's weather to the west because winds are moving it to the east. So we look to the past to be able to anticipate the present. That's within the realm of science. That's within the realm of presumption that is of use to us, right? It helps us decide whether to, take an umbrella with us or not. But in terms of the decisive ends that we are trying to secure. A child's game secures our ends. Those ends are ends of a complete solution here and now. That's achieved only within rigorous philosophic space, and rigorous philosophic space looks forward, not back, because the past is no guarantee of what's to come, rigorously. So the general orientation of the philosophic temperament is the same as the general orientation of youth, looking forward. There's an aphorism that sort of summarizes that. Insofar as we are engaged in a philosophic enterprise and coming to terms with what we can rigorously know, freeing ourselves from the past and from the presumptions of the past, well, we ride the world growing young. It's actually an aphorism that I wrote before I read that aphorism by Picasso. It's in a similar spirit, but it comes from a slightly different direction. But in any case, it's similar to Picasso, but it was conceived independently of Picasso's comment about it taking a very long time to become young. Youth looks forward. One of the things that youth tends to be associated with is the challenging, rejection of authority, where authority tends to be based upon what we have celebrated in the past, what has earned its credentials before us in the past. There are lots of comments, that have been written about young people, the new generation, the young generation throughout history. And going back, there's like a celebrated such set of comments that are attributed to Socrates. I was going to quote them. I was going to write them out, but they might be apocryphal. They might not really have been said by Socrates. They're certainly not in the spirit of Socrates, where Socrates is complaining about the youth of his time and their lack of respect, for elders, and their lack of respect and embrace of authority, right? Well, again, I'm not really sure if it probably was filtered somewhat through Plato, but even in that instance, it's easy for things, that are not quite truly originating from an individual to be ascribed to them. Maybe there was some element, of truth in that, but then it gets amplified and distorted. So it doesn't feel like, because Socrates himself was challenging authority. He was challenging the authority of the gods. He was challenging everything based upon an inquiry into, really, epistemology, how we know what we think we know, and if in fact we know what we claim to know. I mean, that was central, to Socrates's philosophic enterprise. It was what made him basically the originator of Western philosophy as it flowered and as it flourished and as it developed, and why Socrates can lay claim to being the most famous of all philosophers. I've always used as an example, those words that end Plato's Apology, which details Socrates' trial, for corrupting the youth of Athens by challenging the gods and the authority of the gods. That's common to what philosophy does. And remember the consolation that Socrates offers to his friends who are distraught over Socrates' conviction and his being condemned, to drink hemlock. And so we go our separate ways, Socrates says, you to live and I to die, and which is better, only God knows. We don't know. We suffer insofar as we claim to know or think we know. That's the philosophic liberation. So there is, from the beginning of the Western philosophical tradition, at least from its beginning in Socrates, the challenging of authority. And the challenging of authority is, again, in the spirit of youth, right? Youth is often irreverent. They will not accept something simply because somebody has told them so. And often the acceptance of things, because it was told, has been an impediment to intellectual progress. Right? I mean, for, how many years? About 1,500 years, even a little more, maybe close to 2,000 years. Aristotle was the unchallenged authority. Aristotle had various claims about the nature of motion, about the nature of physics. That two objects of different weight would reach the ground at different times, that people accepted. Galileo challenged that authority. That challenging of that authority of Aristotle is central to the birth of modern science and technology. There's a funny story. Aristotle claimed that he was as interested in biology as he was in ethics, in politics, in philosophy per se, in metaphysics. Again, he was one of the most capacious minds. His mind had as great a capacity as a human mind seems to have presented itself with. Well, he famously noted that the male human has 32 teeth. Women, he said, had 30. One thinks maybe he was trying to reason this out, that the female mouth was smaller than the male mouth in general, so maybe it couldn't accommodate as many teeth. It's not clear. But in any case, it's not right. Men and women both have, for a full set of teeth, 32. Aristotle was married, or at least seems to have been married twice. One can challenge that. I mean, it's hard to know exactly when one's dealing with events over 2,000 years ago. But Bertrand Russell, the 20th century English philosopher, famously remarked, in relation to that claim of Aristotle that women had fewer teeth than men, if Aristotle had been married, you would think he would have looked in his wife's mouth. But that authority, that belief persisted. So a challenging of authority is central also to the scientific enterprise. It is especially central to what philosophy is doing, and it is characteristic of the experience, the nature, the temperament, the orientation of youth. Right? And in many instances, that questioning of authority, that challenging of authority is because authorities are telling us things that we might not have yet directly experienced. And experience is what's decisive. I have a background in medicine. When we are in medical school, and we are learning medicine. We are being taught based upon studies, controlled, the ideal standard is double-blind controlled experiments to come up with conclusions about like the effectiveness of drugs. So in general, one is taught based upon scientific research, carefully controlled scientific research. But when one is practicing medicine, the best doctors are practicing anecdotally. They're practicing not based upon these general studies, they're practicing based upon their specific clinical experience with particular patients, with particular conditions. It's very specific. That's the art of medicine. So there is the primacy of experience is central even in a highly sophisticated, highly technological undertaking like modern medicine. So it's not surprising, that youth in general should question authority. And I've made the point, Wittgenstein has made the point that one doesn't want to reject people out of hand, but one wants to question. This week, one of my college roommates is visiting and talking about like youth. So that brings me back, to an earlier period of my life, obviously. We were having a discussion the other day, and I was telling him, I forget exactly how this developed, but I was telling him about the three most uninformed, and I'll be blunt, the three stupidest things that were ever said to me. And they relate to this context. And one of those was, and I'm not going to, give names and dates, but one was by a very eminent professor, very learned, the head of a major institute within a medical community. I was introduced to him because a group of people thought that given his breadth of knowledge and his depth of understanding, he might engage me. I might find someone that I could commune with intellectually in this particular environment. So we met and we talked for about an hour and a half. And we talked over a wide range of topics. And again, this was in a medical context. And as often happens when we're talking broadly medically, I might refer to Siddhartha Gautama, Buddhism, because of his interest in, quote, ending disease, old age, and death, right? So I mentioned that, and I got a fascinating response. I said, that I explained that, the Buddha was motivated by that challenge and felt he had been successful in the elaboration of Buddhism. And the immediate response I got was, he was arrogant. That's presumptuous. That is not being open to what a mind of the magnitude of Siddhartha Gautama might have to offer. His results may not be correct. We may not end up embracing them, but we cannot summarily dismiss them. That is the mature attitude to authority, to investigate the possibility that there is some merit, even if the claim seems outrageous, if the person, the mind that's making the claim is, for all based on what we know, formidable, a formidable intelligence. There's There's a story I've told, also situated at Harvard, where that other encounter was not, by the way, a circumstance where a professor, Rogers Albritton, professor of philosophy at Harvard when I was there, was giving a course on the philosophy of religion. He spent half of the course, like the first 6 weeks of the lectures, and I was auditing the course. I was just sitting in on the lectures, investigating the 6 proofs of the existence of God that St. Thomas Aquinas had elaborated in his Summa Theologica, one of the great works in the history of philosophy. After 6 weeks, Albritton concluded that the proofs did not stand up to rigorous evaluation. They did not prove what Aquinas thought they might have been able to prove, the existence of God. But Albritton justified spending that much time investigating them as carefully as he did, because, as he said, Aquinas was so great a mind that it had to be taken seriously. These results had to be investigated seriously, just on the possibility that so great a mind had achieved something otherwise unlikely but extraordinary. So that's an attitude to authority. We don't want to reject it out of hand, as that professor was inclined to do, maybe as young people might be inclined to do overmuch, but we want to always question authority. That is central to the philosophical enterprise. Philosophy is always and relentlessly investigating our claims to knowledge from the beginning of Western philosophy. Now, and so in the course of doing that, we are freeing ourselves typically from premature claims. Right? We suffocate under premature senses of reality. Philosophy lets us breathe again. And in terms of its undertaking, a lot of what philosophy ends up doing in terms of the challenge of authority that is so much in common with the spirit of youth is something summarized in an aphorism: bit by bit, brick by brick, we dismantle the kingdoms of illusion. A lot of philosophy is negative. There's an aphorism that ends that book, Issues of Objects. Preeminently, philosophy is a weapon. It kills on behalf of the meaning of the world. A lot of what philosophy does seems destructive, but it's only destructive of houses of cards, and it's establishing a firm foundation to our lives. That's what the epistemic achieves, a firm, incontrovertible foundation to our lives. And that epistemic is of youth and wonder. It is strange and beautiful and new. Now, one of the ways that we maintain this youthful orientation, one of the things that characterizes youth, is a general orientation. I mean, obviously, as I've said before, youth is looking forward, age is looking back. Picasso lived a very long life. He lived into his early 90s, and it was a creative life. Picasso was known, or supposedly never thought of age, never thought of death. He maintained this spirit of youth, this youthful intensity and vitality and orientation not to the past, but to the future through creativity. Creativity, the bringing into the world of new things, new objects, new realizing an evolving and always fresh vision. That is a characteristic of youth. That keeps us young. That's essential to the experience, the lifetime experience of youthfulness in terms of our mind and in terms of our spirit, right? I wanted to, and it's partly a matter too of being aware in detail of how so much is new and how so much is creatively possible. There's, I had an encounter some years back with IKEA. They were interested in my art. They were thinking of changing the direction of their company and doing for art what they did for home furnishings. It's a long story. But when I met with their design team and their business team in Sweden, they emphasized to me that they didn't patent. They didn't spend money on patents. A lot of their products were copied by others, but they didn't try to protect what they did. What they focused on instead was constantly innovating, constantly creating, constantly moving forward. They embraced always the new. And the new can be right in front of our eyes, as I've stressed, with the epistemic, always. Renoir, painter, 19th century French Impressionist painter, once said his only regret was not having painted a single subject, having painted more than one subject. He felt that within a particular subject, a particular face, there was every possibility for exploration of novelty. We see it in Monet, who painted a given motif over and over and over again, dozens of times, haystacks, dozens of times, because every time the lighting would be different, something would be different, and it would create a new work, give rise to a new work. This notion of seeing novelty in everything around us always is a matter of seeing with sufficient particularity, paying particular and sufficient attention. That's, again, how we come to terms with how we end up embracing the epistemic, that the world is in fact new every moment. If we could see quantum mechanically, if we could see at the level, of atoms and nuclei and electrons, well, nothing would ever seem the same to us. Well, if we see the world around us with sufficient attention to detail, it is a world of novelty, a world, again, that's epistemic and always new. There's a famous producer in Hollywood. His name is Norman Lear. He did, let's make sure the other time. Yes, okay. He did a lot of comedies, situation comedies, they're called, for decades. He's one of the most successful producers in the history of television in particular, in the United States. Well, Norman Lear just turned 99. Okay? And he was asked in an interview I just heard with him a few weeks ago. How does he stay young? 99. And when you hear him, he sounds vital, sounds alive. he has like a youthful spirit, a youthful vision at 99. And you said, every time he leaves his house, every time he goes out for a walk, every time he goes for a drive, no matter how many times he goes down the same path, he always looks for something new. He makes it a point that every time he's out, he will see something he has not seen before, no matter how many times he's been on that particular path. It's something I practice too. I mean, you can always see a new blade of grass. You can always see, there is more novelty to see than there is sameness if one just pays sufficient attention and looks closely enough. It's what, when I was visiting IKEA, they gave me a handbook that I think had been written by the founder of IKEA, Ingvar Kamprad. And it emphasized the point that there is more to create, more to invent, more to imagine and design and bring into the world than has been created, imagined to now. There are more things left to do than there are things done, if one is just attentive and creative and facing life with that spirit of bringing novelty into the world, partly by appreciating novelty where one encounters it, which in principle is everywhere, if one is just paying sufficient attention. There's a story that I told before. I want to tell it again briefly. It's about Wittgenstein and a student of his, Norman Malcolm. Norman Malcolm was an American philosopher who was studying with Wittgenstein in the 1930s. They became friends. At some point, World War II breaks out, right? And like in 1941 for the United States. And Norman Malcolm enlists in the Navy. He goes off to fight in World War II. But he's in correspondence with Wittgenstein. And a lot of warfare, if you read works like Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage, is boring. A lot of it is terrifying, a lot of it is boring. So Norman Malcolm, early in his enlistment, was complaining about the boredom of the war to Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein would write back about this issue of war being a boredom. And Wittgenstein had been in World War I. Wittgenstein said, if you look closely enough, if you pay sufficient attention to what's going on around you, I am sure you will not find things that boring. It's a matter of paying sufficient attention. Novelty is everywhere. The epistemic, fundamentally strange and beautiful and new, is the reality. We just have to see it. And we have to see it in terms of the novelty of each circumstance. That means paying attention to detail. It's the same point that's made in a movie from the 1990s, a movie called Michael, that stars John Travolta. John Travolta plays an archangel, Michael, who has come to Earth on a mission to basically bring two people together. And it's his last mission on Earth. Apparently, archangels are allowed to visit only 25 times to carry out specific tasks, and then they are permanently in heaven. Well, at various times, he displays a lot of insight into the people around him and circumstances, and it's not like a supernatural insight. It's based upon what he's observing, what he's seeing in the way Sherlock Holmes observes. He's a fictional character, but if you read Sherlock Holmes, he's paying attention both to what's there to see and what's not there to see. If a certain account of something is likely to be true, that means certain things will be present, other things will be absent. He's taking both of those into account. Well, when Michael is asked how he knew all the things that he knew, he answered quite simply by paying attention, sufficient attention. It's not, again, a matter of supernatural agency. It's a matter of a focus on the particularities, the details, of our circumstances, of our world. That's the epistemic reality. And that, again, is what is eternally new. Now, I know we're getting close to time, but I still have a few more things quickly that I want to do. Two more things. One aspect of the epistemic, one aspect of its youthful character is that it is fundamentally a timeless space, so that there's no such thing as aging within the epistemic. It is timeless. And there's a paragraph from Phalaris's Bull that explains that, conveys that. So let me just recite that quickly. And it goes, the epistemic is a timeless space. It is, oops, did I forget that? Shoot, my mind just went blank on that. Let me just reacquaint myself with it for a second. It'll just take a minute here for me to then recite. Okay, it is a timeless space. When Einstein began work on the theory of relativity, he asked himself not what is time, but how do we measure time? Through repetitive processes, a heartbeat, a pendulum, a rotating earth, a vibrating atom. But these repetitions are only approximately equal within tolerances, heuristically, not exactly. Within the precisions of epistemic space, there are no true repetitions. There is no time. Time is an approximation to reality, like religious eternity. Now, finally, I want to end on
Super.
one.
Thank you.
I'm going to end on
Thank you
this
very
one more
much.
note. Okay.
Mhm.
I was at a Christmas party a few years ago. It was a Christmas party given by my producer, the producer of Phalaris's Bull. It was a small gathering. And at some point during the party, there was a discussion of age and people's chronological age. And I listened for a little bit. And then I recited something, a little paragraph from the books of Joshua. And I'll tell you the significance. I'll recite it and then quickly give you the significance of it. So it goes, age is hearsay, says the sage. When we think we came to be is elemental mythology. One day Joshua asked a friend, does philosophy have a patron saint to help secure its end? On November 25th of a misplaced year, she called from Huntsville to reveal St. Catherine as the keeper of the seal, the learned Catherine of the elevated wheel, whose voice led Joan to her choice and her appeal. And so was Joshua born on the feast day of a tortured form, the feast day of philosophy, in the shadow of a dragon tree. Now, two things about that. First of all, when I recited that, it silenced the room. Okay? There was no more discussion about age. And I've made the point a number of times that philosophy doesn't aim at its highest level to stimulate discussion. It wants to end it. That's what incontrovertible truth achieves. When the early Wittgenstein, in his work of his Tractatus, the one work published in his lifetime, felt he had solved all philosophical problems. He later decided otherwise, but when he felt he had solved all philosophical problems, what did he do? He didn't become a professor of philosophy. He left philosophy, and he went off and became a gardener and a school teacher, and in Austria, and he lived in a hut, by himself in Norway. He left philosophy because he had thought he had solved all philosophical problems. That's the goal, not to have endless chatter, endless discussion, endless academic debate, to end it. Okay? So the fact that that paragraph ended the debate about age is in the spirit of what philosophy is meant to achieve. But in relation more specifically to tonight's topic, Saint Catherine of Alexandria is the patron saint of philosophy. That's the person referred to. That's the person who was the source of Joan of Arc's voices that guided Joan on her mission, to save France, free France from the English. Saint Catherine of Alexandria was a woman renowned for her learning. She was a girl, actually. She was tortured to death for her learning on the wheel. Saint Catherine of Alexandria, the patron saint of philosophy, is not an aged woman, an aged man. She is a young girl of 19. And that is the guiding spirit of philosophy. So philosophy embraces as the epistemic, as that rigorous realm, that philosophical realm, what is strange and beautiful and new, under the guiding spirit of a young girl. So philosophy is aligned with youth. It is aligned with wonder, and it is always young, always in wonder of the world. Okay, now let's look at questions. I have to be honest, there was a question from last time, one question I got, and I'm not totally clear on the question. The question is about the atomic bombs, which was last week's topic, in relation to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. How the relation between the atomic bombs and the American Revolution in history and philosophy. I am not totally clear on exactly what's being asked, but let me say a few things. In terms of the American Revolution was a movement of freedom and independence from a monarchy, from a colonial rule. The use of the atomic bombs was not to conquer a land, conquer Japan, and establish colonial rule over Japan. Now, the United States did occupy Japan for a number of years, maybe about 10 years after the war, and it helped rebuild its economy. It also helped establish democratic institutions that are still maintained to this day. The Japanese people had embraced a tradition of the samurai, right? A warrior culture. That came to an end with the atomic bombing. The atomic bombing was so horrific, in the impact, the psychological impact it had on that country and on its people, that it basically transformed that plus the experience of World War II. It transformed that people, that culture, from something focused upon a samurai war tradition to something focused upon what? technology and innovation and gadgets and even cuteness. They celebrate the aesthetics of the cute and anime, and so it's changed the focus of the culture. And the United States, it brought baseball, it brought things that Japanese culture has embraced. But the point is, the United States did not make Japan a colony. So it wasn't.
Super, thank you.
Is that okay? Is that, I guess? Oh yes,
We have only 4 minutes left before the program finishes, so we have to answer the question from the previous lecture very quickly.
okay. Oh, so yes, so I think so. That's part. That I was just giving that answer. The
Okay, uh-huh.
other. I mean, I think so. So the atomic bombs are not, even though they were used to end World War II, and even though there's horror associated with war with those atomic bombings, they didn't facilitate the colonialization of Japan, and so their use was not inconsistent with the basic principles of the American Revolution. That's the point that I wanted to make. Now, were there any other questions from last time, or just that one?
No, but we do have a lot of questions today
Okay.
that we will definitely address next week. And also, we have Daniel again. Daniel, hello. Thank you for joining us. He's
Thank you.
the guy who joins us weekly, and he has a lot of
Yes.
questions that we will
Lots of
address next time.
questions.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for your active participants. Then we have Ekaterina. She's also an active participant of ours. Thank you very
Yes.
much,
Yes.
Ekaterina, for joining us.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And just very briefly, I would just read out a few questions from today's lecture, just for us to have them noted. So one of the questions given from Daniel is foreseeing that you need to have a big fantasy and imagination. Do you agree? And just another one. And what about that thing that future or present may explain past, or vice versa? Past might explain your present and predict your future. Such a great question.
Okay.
So, and also Daniel was giving us a comment. Thanks for the lecture. It was so interesting. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Yes, we all are going to need to go in a minute, Danielle. So yes, you're not alone in that.
And we also have a lot of thumbs up from people. Thank you very much. Guljamal, Eric, Kwanish, and Hamza. Thank you. We appreciate it all. We see it all. Thank you. And before we finish, one more time, we would like to thank our amazing speaker, Stephen Friedman, a great philosopher and a great speaker of our Philosophical Talks Weekly. Also, we'd like to thank the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience, for joining us weekly, for being active, and we appreciate it all. If you still have any comments or questions, please put them in the description down below. We'll address them next week. Thank you very much and have a great week.
Thank you very much, everyone. I hope to see you all next week. Thank you.